Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. And I say tonight advisedly, recognize that some of you are on the West Coast where it's just late evening, and there will be some of you from points beyond where it's either mid-afternoon or very, very late at night. But wherever you live, thank you so much for joining us. You're in for a real treat tonight. And before I introduce our presenter, Gus Medina, let me just give you a sense of where we're going tonight. Or I say tonight again, but over the next hour. Our presenter, Gus Medina, will speak for 25 to 30 minutes, after which we'll throw it open for questions, formal questions. But you don't have to wait to ask a question of Gus or make a comment or alert me to any technical difficulties you may be having. Feel free to post something in the chat box, and some of you have already commented or made comments in the chat box, which is the box with all the text flowing through it in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And just below that, you'll see that there's something called Main Room and a horizontal empty box beside it. So if you've not been on one of our webinars, that's the place where you type in a question or a comment, and do that just while Gus is doing his presentation. Especially if you have any technical difficulties, let me know. For example, someone just told me a moment ago they're dialing in on the phone rather than doing this through the internet. If you've got a busy signal, please try again. And some of you have also commented that you're hearing kind of strong weather in the background. It almost sounds like a thunder. One brief moment there just before we started the archive. So we're not quite sure what that is, but we've had much worse technical difficulties in the past. So as long as you can hear our presenter well in the next few moments, and you can hear me at this point modestly well, I think we're good to go. So that's the chat box, and I would encourage you to make any comments you wish and respond to anyone else's questions that you see in the chat box. That's why it's there. And moving on, just again before I introduce Gus, just to say a word about Green Teacher, the sponsor of this. It's a non-profit. We've been publishing this non-profit magazine called Green Teacher for now close to years, and it's a place where people share their best ideas for innovative ideas for educating kids, whether inside or outside school. In the last 10 years, we've had an opportunity to publish some books, and they are, thanks, Gus. And as you can see, collections of the best articles in Green Teacher. If you are not yet a subscriber to Green Teacher, please do consider, and if you find this webinar to be useful, please consider taking out a subscription or buying a book after this webinar. Anyways, without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker. Gus Medina has been a leader in environmental education really for quite some time. He currently manages a project called EE Capacity. It's a national U.S. project funded by the U.S. EPA, intended to help anyone who wants to increase their effectiveness as an environmental educator. And it's basically a project that addresses the question, what does environmental education look like in a society that's increasingly urban, culturally diverse? Prior to this, Gus served, or Dr. Medina served as a project manager for a similar project called the ETAP project, Environmental Education and Training Partnership, which was a consortium of organizations that increased the capacity of education professionals to deliver high-quality environmental education. That project also produced a number of publications, including one related to this webinar, What's Fair Got to Do With It? Diversity Cases for Environmental Educators. And along with that came a day-long workshop that examined the intersection of environmental education and cultural diversity, along with an online course about how to make environmental education more relevant for diverse audiences. And I can't think of a better person to be addressing this particular topic than Gus Medina. Gus, a hearty welcome to you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tim, and hello to everybody out there. It's wonderful to be here, and what a great use of technology to share information and ideas across all parts of the country and maybe all parts of the world. Don't quite know where everybody's from, but if you have a chance, kind of put in the chat box where you're from. I'm going to start with an overview of the presentation tonight. Like Tim said, I'm going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and comments and ask that people kind of share their own ideas, successes that they've had in terms of working with being more inclusive. So the presentation tonight, I'm going to spend a few minutes just kind of developing a common understanding. So what do we mean by culture? What do we mean by diversity? What do we mean by inclusiveness? Or what do I mean by those things? And then I'm going to share some information about a project that was funded through the Environmental Education and Training Partnership, ETAP. And then I'm going to focus in on that project a little bit more closely, talk about organizational profiles, who were the organizations that participated, and then kind of look at the kinds of things that help these organizations move forward in terms of becoming more inclusive, what types of things held them back, and what lessons were learned, and along with lessons, the sort of strategies as well. And then we'll open it up to questions and sharing, and while you guys are submitting questions for Tim to kind of collate and pull together, I will then talk about several resources that I've pulled together that will be available to you when, as a PDF file, when Tim sort of mails out his email to everybody who signed up for this webinar tomorrow. So I will repeat that later on. Before I move into the actual presentation, I did want to say this presentation tonight is adapted from a presentation that was developed by the More Inclusive Organizations Learning Community at the 2009 NAAE conference in Oregon. And I've built on the presentation that we developed at that time, and I adapted it for this evening. So, getting to common understanding. Culture, what is it? And most of us, most of the time, don't think about culture, because if we're members of the dominant culture, our culture tends to be reinforced everywhere we look, everywhere we go. We tend to basically see culture reflected, our culture reflected all around us, and that pretty much becomes the norm, the standard for how we see the world and how we think the world should be. And it's important to realize that culture is learned, and that it's shared beliefs and values that are applied to social interactions and the interpretation of experience. We often, within a culture, we often embrace more than one culture. So, for example, many of us on this call probably identify with an environmental education subculture. And when you are with that group, you can use certain terminology, there are certain references you can make, there are certain jokes that you can make that people within that culture understand. But when you begin to talk that way, let's say with a different subculture, maybe your spouse at home or your friends at the bar, they may start looking at you a little strange and say, what is this person talking about? So, I mentioned cultures, and I've mentioned, and diversity is basically a manifestation of all of those different cultures. Just a thought while you're listening. When did you, as I mentioned, often culture is, we don't think about it because it surrounds us, especially if we're a member of the dominant culture. People that are in cultures that are not part of the dominant culture are often reminded very early and very often that their culture is different from the dominant culture. When did you first realize yourselves that the values and the beliefs that you held or you thought were sort of the values, when did you first realize that, there were people out there that didn't share those values or had different values? And how did you feel about that? Again, just for chatting in the chat box. Another term that's often used is cultural competency, and it's a set of skills, knowledge, and attitudes which enhance an individual's awareness. Awareness of his or her own assumptions and values, as well as other prevailing attitudes towards culture. And as I mentioned earlier, again, if you're a member of, often if you're in the dominant culture, you don't think too much about culture, and you only really sort of realize that you have a culture when you come into contact with someone who has a culture that's different from yours. And all of a sudden, oh, this is different. This is not the way I do things. And by the nature of culture, it also tends to be very, we tend to think that that's the way the world works. That's the right way. That is the correct way. Another part of cultural competency, once you understand or getting to know your own culture and what assumptions and beliefs you have, then the next stage is also looking at other cultures and developing respect for that, rather than thinking that my culture is the right culture or the way that things are done, that other cultures have a different way of doing things, and they're not good or not necessarily bad. It's just a different way of doing things. And cultures very much respond and grow out of an environmental context, an environmental societal context. Finally, you begin to be able to move back and forth and adapt your behavior as you move from one culture to another. Most of us have that experience with subcultures that we experience on a day-to-day basis. For example, if you go to an office or you go to work, that's a subculture, and you tend to behave and do things a little bit differently than you would do them in your home, or when you're out with friends, or when you're on a ski trip with ski buddies. So again, the ability to move among these subcultures, and even though all of those subcultures I mentioned are there, they often share a lot of things in common. So it's not too hard to transition, and we've had experience with them. When we come into contact with cultures that are very different, then we have a lot more difficulty in terms of being able to adapt to those cultures and change our behavior so that we can fit in or work with that culture more effectively. And what do I mean by inclusiveness? To me, inclusiveness is about creating an environment in which diverse people feel welcome, valued, engaged, and empowered. And I would imagine that most of you are listening to this workshop or webinar tonight because you're interested in working with audiences that basically have different worldviews than you have. And you may have tried different things or different approaches to interact with that or bring that community into your programs or have them share the things that you care about. And you've had maybe limited success, or maybe you've had lots of success. And I hope that some of you have, so you can share some of those experiences. So we're going to move into project goals. We started, when I say we, I'm talking about myself and Lisa LaRock, co-director, and Alma Galvan, co-director of Intercambios. And I started to work with these two ladies about almost 8 to 10 years ago because we realized at that point that environmental educators needed additional tools to be able to work effectively with cultures and groups that had different worldviews than their own. And often people think about this primarily in terms of race, but I'm not thinking of it simply in terms of race or only race. When you go out and work with a different audience, for example, that's a different subculture. If you're working with urban youth versus working with a group of ranchers in Montana around environmental issues, I think you would agree that you probably would have programs that look very different, or they would focus on different things. So we realized that environmental educators needed more tools, and we tried a number of things, and we created Tim mentioned the book, What's Fair Got to Do With It, and the one-day workshops. And we realized that while those played a role, many of the educators still felt that they really didn't have the tools to effectively deal with those issues. So we moved into trying to do something that was more long-term and more sustained and more supportive. And these are the project goals we created. One was creating a learning community so that the people participating in the project could learn from each other and could help each other and be supportive and share the challenges as well as successes. We wanted to better understand what it means to become inclusive and what an organization would look like or feel like if it was inclusive. To capture the process that people go through, organizations go through to become more inclusive, to provide more concrete examples, and to develop strategies to become more inclusive. We designed the project. We put out a call for presentations. We had over 100 requests for additional information about the project. We had 12 actual applicants, and from those 12, we selected 3 organizations to participate in the project. The first one I'm going to tell you about is EcoEd, which is a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's an organization that basically provides environmental education through the school system, and it works with teachers and helps teachers basically work with their students to design programs that focus on the community. Just waiting here for the next slide to come up. And here's just some slides of the organization and some of the activities that they're involved in. The next organization was the Norfolk Environmental Council. This is a quasi-governmental organization in the city of Norfolk, and it's responsible for things like recycling and beautification of Norfolk. It wanted to basically, well, I won't go there right now. And here's a typical exhibit that the NEC, Norfolk Environmental Commission, might put up at a conference or at an event that it's doing in the Norfolk area. The next organization is called PEC, Partners for Cultural Connectedness. And this is kind of an unusual organization in the sense that it's kind of a collection of organizations that includes federal agencies, it includes a university, it includes an association or organization of environmental educators, and it includes some community groups. And all of these organizations, we chose these organizations purposely. They're quite different from each other because we wanted to see if they shared similar experience as they worked to becoming more inclusive. But we also, and we also wanted to kind of have different parts of the country reflected and different scenarios. So EcoEd was working with youth, NEC, the Norfolk Council, was working with adults, PEC was working with adults and youth, so and involved a variety of different players. And here's a slide of some of the logos of PEC and some of the organizations involved. So I'm going to talk about this project in 3 phases. One is the baseline phase, another one is the planning phase, and the last one is called the implementations phase. And in each one of these phases, I'm going to talk a little bit about what these organizations encountered. Again, in each case, the organizations were trying to draw in or work with, engage communities that they had not traditionally been involved with but wanted to work with. Many of them had attempted to work with these communities and had sort of mixed results. So, for example, EcoEd wanted to work with the Hmong community. PEC wanted to work with the Michoacan Latino community in Las Vegas, and NEC wanted to work with the African American community in Norfolk. So, all of these organizations coming into the project, what kinds of things did they have going for them? And as I'm going through these items, I want you to think about what exists within your organizations now that would really help you work with diverse audiences, be more inclusive. So one of the things was that these organizations were committed. The group was already committed. And when I'm talking about committed, I'm talking about the board, I'm talking about the higher administration, I'm talking about the staff. So people were on board. They realized this was something that they wanted to do, this is something that they needed to do, and this is something that they were willing to do and spend the time on. With respect to adjustment to scope, they were flexible in terms of what it was that they thought they needed to do. All of them sort of had connections with the community. For example, the Norfolk Environmental Center had some members on their board of directors who were representative of the African American community. They had one person from one of the communities that they were considering working with on their board. And that's really key, because oftentimes organizations don't represent the community, or they don't have people on their board or on their staff that reflect the communities that they're working with. That was definitely the case with EcoEd. They were working with a Hmong community, and there were no Hmong or Asian related groups on their board or their staff, or the teachers working in the school system for that matter. What moved organizations forward in the planning phase? Again, flexibility, the ability to change, easily go back and forth. The willingness to focus on process, the willingness to build relationships, the willingness to kind of put their agenda aside, and I'll be talking more about that, and the willingness, taking time to listen. These were all factors that were really important in helping the organizations move forward during the planning phase. I need to do a better job of advancing these slides. All right, what holds people back? What holds organizations back during the baseline phase? the biggest problem is not knowing where to start, where to begin. What do I do? There's no manual that says step 1, step 2, step 3. This is something that an organization has to kind of create for itself. Another item that sort of keeps organizations, holds them back, is creating the plan. And this is kind of like a false sense of security. All of the organizations came to an initial planning meeting where we asked them to develop blueprints or action plans, and they laid out what they wanted to do. And this provided a degree of kind of comfort, but also a sense of false security, because what we do when we're planning is basically go back to the tools that we are most comfortable using and that we've used in the past. So we tend to repeat things that we have done in the past which have not actually given us the results that we would like. But that's what's familiar, that's what's comfortable, and we tend to think, well, if we just tweak it, if we do this a little bit differently, it'll work this time. Another thing that held organizations back during the baseline is that they had a very narrow view of the community. They sort of like, when NEC was looking at the African American community in Norfolk, it was this rather large amorphous group that basically all thought and felt and had the same attitudes and values and beliefs. And that's not the case. Wasn't the case with the African American community, and it's not the case with any community. During the planning phase, some of the things that held them back: assumptions checked, pride of professionals. One of the things we all do is we tend to jump in and make assumptions about a community, about what that community needs, about how that community should do its work. And that's because we often tend to think of ourselves as experts. We're the specialists. We're the ones that have the, quote, education. And there's definite value in those things, but they also basically create barriers in terms of being able to communicate and listen to people, listen to the community. A question for you. I mean, when you're looking or thinking about creating a program, to what extent do you actually go out and learn about that community, engage that community, build relationships with that community? How much effort do you spend on that versus creating a program or adapting a program to what you think that community needs? Just a thought. Another thing that holds people back is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of not knowing how to proceed. And I'm not talking about sort of major things here. One of the things that we suggested to community, these organizations, for example, NEC, was you need to go to the community and sit in on meetings and listen and hear what people are talking about in the community. What's important to them? How do they talk about things? Who are the leaders? Who do they respect? What issues are important to them? And the staff at NEC were very uncertain about about going in there and sitting in a meeting and not talking. And this is where we basically asked them to put their agenda aside. You need to sort of put your mission statement, your goals, your timelines, and put all that aside and go in with a really open-ended sort of mindset to be able to really hear and listen what is being said in the community. The other thing that held them back was addressing cultural inclusiveness as a separate component, viewing it as a standalone. And this by far, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for any organization, because again, they believe that all I have to do is tweak this or make a few changes, and they see this as sort of an addition to what they're already doing. And that's a fatal mistake in terms of being able to make progress. During the implementation phase, one of the challenges was obligations to the organization taking priority over the relationship to the community. And all of us face this in the organizations that we work in. We have timelines, or times when reports are due, times when we have to get back to funders. We have all these organizational issues that interfere with our ability to kind of take the time and spend the time to get to know the community on a very personal level and develop the relationships. So you really need to figure out how to do that. There's one of the cases in the book about what's fair, where an organization is really trying to get a Native group, an indigenous group, to submit an application for a program, but they have this timeline and deadline by which the application has to be in, and the application doesn't arrive, and they are really getting quite uptight about it not coming in. So think about your organizations and how do you work in that? How do you build in that flexibility? The other thing that holds organizations back is expecting big results. I mean, we all want to have this impact, and that's problematic, again, because it takes time to develop relationships, to build trust in a community. So we basically say start out small and build incrementally, build on success. So now I've gone through all of those. How many of you basically see some of those things in your own organizations? What kinds of things are holding you back from basically being more inclusive? I listed a few. There are many more. You probably have some that are unique to your organization. So now talking about what did we learn through this? One of the things was seeking to understand the community. And not only is it a matter of taking the time to develop relationships and learn what's important to the community and what they're concerned about, but then also valuing, because it does no good if you basically go in and do all those things and then basically do what you were planning to do originally anyway, which may or may not be suitable for this community. But I think you really have to acknowledge what's important to that community and then figure out win-win scenarios. The other thing when you're going into any community is right from the start, realize communities are complex. They're not monolithic. There's a large range of opinions and ideas and ways of doing things. And part of developing a relationship with a community is understanding that and learning how to maneuver through that. In the planning phase, lessons learned. A one-size program doesn't fit all. I mean, EcoEd realized this, NEC realized this, PEC realized this, and they all sort of went in with the idea that they could just tweak and adapt their current program to meet the needs of this new community they wanted to work with, and they realized they had to step back and kind of design in collaboration with the community. Diversity is not just race. I'm going to come back to that in the next slide, but let me jump to finding the bridge. Lots all of these organizations were successful because they were able to find individuals within the community who could be ambassadors with the community they wanted to work with and were able to communicate effectively with the organization. They're called boundary runners, ambassadors, but these are people that can move back and forth between the two cultures, the culture of your organization and the cultures of the community, and can translate and interpret what's going on. For example, sometimes a community says yes, but they may not mean yes because saying no is impolite. So sometimes you need guidance of somebody on the inside who basically understands the language. So getting back to this issue about race, we have people here from Canada and the United States and other parts, but at least in the United States, because of the history of slavery, race tends to play a dominant role when we think about diversity. But if you look at this chart, 4 layers of diversity, their internal dimensions and age, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, ethnicity, and race. You can see race is only one component of this. And then you've got this other dimension called external dimensions and organizational dimensions. And in the middle is personality. I mean, this is what really makes us who we are. Yes, we're kind of molded and shaped by all these others, but in the end, all of us are individuals. We have distinct personalities and distinct ways of seeing the world, and we want to be treated as an individual. We don't want to be treated as a member of a group, as a member of a race. And while all those things are important, they're only one piece of it. And we make a mistake if we only think about race. In the implementation lessons learned, one is be prepared for personal change. A lot of the process in terms of becoming more inclusive is reflection. Taking the time to think about your assumptions, why you believe what you believe, looking at what others believe and thinking about it. So reflection is an important part, and personal change is an important part that results from that reflection. You need to be ready for that, both in terms of individual and your organization. If you're going to be inclusive, if you're going to achieve inclusiveness, your organization will change. It will be different. By the nature, it has to if you're going to be inclusive. The other, I think, important lesson learned is it takes longer than you think. Think about the long term. This isn't a 1 or 2 year project. This is really a long-term effort that basically ends up changing the character of the organization and its relationship with the community that you want to work with. And it takes years. And it takes individual investment. Sometimes you hear organizations hire consultants to come and do inclusiveness work for them. This can help to a certain extent, but really it's the members of the organization, the board, the staff, the volunteers, who really have to be doing that work because they're the ones who are going to be staying there. They're the ones that have to build that relationship and nurture that relationship. I mentioned checking your assumptions, and again, this is part of that reflection process. We tend to assume a lot of things. Unfortunately, we don't know what we don't know, and we often have to learn that by experience. Sometimes you can cut back on that sort of time of learning by experience by reflecting, bringing in ambassadors, going into communities and listening. But it really takes a conscious effort to think about these things and think about how they apply to you and how they apply to your community. And lastly, I mean, cultural inclusiveness really has to apply to everything across the board. It's not just an add-on to a program. You need to look at your policies. You need to look at your standard operating procedures. You need to look at your programs, at the forms you require people to fill out. What languages are they provided in? Who do they go to? Everything you do as an organization needs to sort of be looked at and reflected. And you don't have to do it. The thing is, you don't have to do it all at once. You start slowly and you build, and this is a process that grows naturally. As you become more familiar with the community, you actually begin to understand the kinds of changes that are needed to make your organization more effective with that community and make it more inclusive. So, real briefly, I've just kind of given you an overview of what we learned from this, some of the strategies that came out of that. We basically had an initial meeting. Then we did conference calls with individual organizations and group conference calls where folks could basically share experiences. The individual meetings were transcribed, and we used the information to help the organizations to facilitate and coach them in terms of moving forward. And then we had a final meeting where everybody came together and shared their experiences and developed these lessons learned. I'm going to now do a couple of things. One is I'm going to ask you to start thinking about, either share strategies based on your own experience or questions that you have about inclusiveness, this process we went through. And I'm going to put up a slide. I'm going to run through several resource slides so you can see the resources that I've kind of pulled out and will be made available to you in a PDF. But I'm going to just sort of click on those slides real quick so you can see them, and then I'll go back and talk to them. And I'll leave the slideshow up on the last slide, which is where you can write in questions that you would like to ask. So let me start running through these. So here's some of the resources, and again, I'm going to come back and talk about some of these in a little bit more detail. Another set of slides about resources, and another set of slides about resources, and there'll be web addresses on the PDF that you receive that will basically take you to where you can either get more information or download these resources. This is contact information, and this will also be on the PDF that you receive from Tim tomorrow. Information about myself and information about Lisa with emails and emails and phone numbers and a web address. And here's the final slide, which basically is a question slide, and you can write your questions in that box, hit the submit button. They'll go to Tim, and he will work through them and come back and ask some of these questions online. Okay, so I'm going to basically, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Gus. That's terrific. And
go ahead.
Well, no, thanks. And you've rightly said, invited everyone to type a question in. If you have more than one question, please put one at a time in, hit submit. Hit the submit button. You'll return to a blank screen in which you can then type in a second question if you have it. So we've got lots of time here, so please ask your questions. Actually, Gus, there was one that's already really been asked, and a couple of people have commented, and I want to thank those who have commented in the chat box for the last 30 minutes. It's been a really good conversation. But one of the questions, Gus, that's already been asked is, what do you do if you're in an organization that has lots of turnover? In other words, making it much more difficult to establish the kind of relationships we were talking about earlier. Any suggestions?
A lot of that, yes. I mean, one thing that you can think about is who are the people that you're hiring and what kinds experiences and skills are they coming to the organization with? So if you want to build a more inclusive organization, then you want to be looking at staff that already bring some of that with them so that you're not starting from square one. As an example, with EcoEd, they had a staff opening, and originally they were planning to hire another environmental educator. And we suggested to them, hey, rather than hiring another environmental educator, what you say you want to be inclusive, what kinds of skills do you actually need? Do you actually need another environmental educator? And as we thought about that and we asked that question, they started to realize, no, they needed somebody who was basically more inclined and had more experience working with the Hmong community. Someone who basically had experience working with communities in general and dealing with community issues. So they took their traditional environmental educator sort of job description and changed that to a more sort of community-oriented, community worker, youth-oriented worker. So I would suggest one is that look at your hiring criteria, look at your criteria for bringing on volunteers, and try to find people that incorporate that and or at least are sensitive to that, are receptive to those ideas, and then develop programs, training programs that have that component incorporated into them. So, so it's this. All of this has to permeate the association, the organization. You start small and you try to build on it, but those are some things that can be done. What is your mission statement say? What does your organization say about what it's supposed to be doing? All those things contribute to creating a climate that's conducive to inclusiveness.
Thanks, Gus. A question sort of related to your this very point. Someone's saying, what do you do? You kind of step back a bit further. What do you do if you're in an organization where they don't realize or don't recognize the need to be inclusive? They're not inclusive and they don't recognize it. What sort of steps can you make to really start opening their eyes?
That's always a tough one because generally you need to find some people either at higher administration levels, management, or on the board. You need allies who think this is important. If none of those people exist, then one of the first things I think you have to start working on is pushing the organization in the direction of bringing on board members and bringing on staff that start to incorporate some of these kind of concepts, skills, familiarity, cultural inclusiveness, and how do you do that? Basically, you can. There's several things you can do. None of them are foolproof, but you can look at your community and you can look at the demographics and what's happening in the community. To what extent is your organization actually serving the community as a whole? Is its mandate to serve the community and is only serving? So I think part of it is showing inconsistencies in what the organization says it's about and what it's actually doing. So first, kind of trying to hold your organization accountable and just bringing that up. Say we say we're this, but we're not really doing this. What are we really about? Should we be making an effort? So there are a number of ways you can kind of move in on that, but it's really critical to get some of those people in at higher management levels and board levels that are thinking this way. And I said a few of the kinds of things that you can start to do to try to make that happen. But, the upper management and the board are not interested, and well, you can either knock your head on the wall, continue knocking your head on the wall if people aren't responsive, or you can move to another organization that's more responsive, or you can start your own organization which is more responsive.
All good answers. And I think that's great because you've really given people a menu of options, and I think that's exactly right. You have to kind of wrestle with what the possibilities are, given the resources, given the resistance, and then decide where to put your energies. Gus, a couple of really interesting and kind of challenging questions here. One is, have you ever had a situation, you talked about taking the time to get to know the community, be willing to set aside your own agenda, that sort of thing. Have you seen situations where there ends up being kind of a transfer of leadership? You engage that cultural community, that immigrant group, let's say, and but gradually over time the project becomes theirs. You've sort of helped get them organized, involved in an environmental education project of their choosing, but ultimately becomes their project. Any sort of experiences you can talk about like that?
I don't have any specific examples where that has happened. I can see that PEC, the group in Las Vegas, could eventually move in that direction. For example, one of the things that they did in terms of trying to connect more closely with the Michoacan community, which is a Mexican community that lives in Las Vegas, and it has roots back to Michoacan in Mexico, is basically the Day of the Dead. Part of Mexican culture is referring to the Day of the Dead. They honor the dead, and this is something that, at least in North America, that we don't tend to focus on, or we don't tend to, we don't see that as something that's just not something we do. Basically, they, with the help of the community and this ambassador, they put together an ofrenda, which is kind of an altar honoring people that had died in Lake Mead over the last year. And this was done at a festival, at a fair, day-long fair. And through that ofrenda or altar, they actually were able to interact with a lot of members of the Mexican community who were quite impressed and felt very positive about the fact that these federal agencies in this university had basically taken the time to do this, and not only did it make a good impression, but they also had an opportunity to talk to members of the community about the importance of boat safety and things like that. And then they started a program where they're actually taking families to the public lands and engaging those families in outdoor experiences. And I can easily see that moving into a situation where the community basically assumes that responsibility with the support, where they sort of take the lead on that. But that I see something that's coming later down. I mean, ideally these programs grow together, and people organizations and communities do this because there's a win-win opportunity for both or whatever number of organizations are participating. And over time, I can see leadership changing and responsibilities shifting, but I can't cite any specific examples where I've seen that actually happen.
Great. And Gus, do you have, someone else said, what do you do if you're working in a national organization, but you want to execute inclusivity. You're working and trying to make things happen at the local level. Any suggestions for, you've worked with national organizations as well that have projects in many communities, suggestions about how you sort of encourage inclusivity at the local level when you yourself are working at the national level? In some ways, that's what you do.
Again, here it's part of an organization and its flexibility in terms of allowing. It's not unusual for organizations basically to have different, what's the term, operating procedures or standards for different places where they operate. International companies do this all the time. You see it with multinationals often. So part of it is looking for that flexibility. If a national organization says inclusiveness is a part of what they're all about, and they want to basically work with local communities, then being flexible and allowing room for doing things differently is a natural sort of requirement of that. I can't see how you can have that mission and then require everybody to do X, Y, and Z exactly the same way. So it's kind of vague. I don't think I'm answering the question very well, but it's the other. That's part of the answer. The other thing is that sometimes you have flexibility and you don't. You have to learn the system. You have to learn how your organization operates. Look for allies within the organization that have a better handle maybe than you do about what's possible, what's doable. Push the envelope, stretch the envelope. Start small, have success, show that off. And if we can be successful at this level, then you may be able to get support and assistance to scale it up at a later time.
Great, thanks, Gus. Another different question relates to religious organizations, and as you know, in many communities, those culturally diverse groups are often very much closely associated with a religion. They meet at the mosque, they meet at the synagogue, they meet in church. Do you have a sense of, and so working with or meeting with those organizations might be the community organization with which one needs to interact. Any thoughts on, or have any of the projects you're aware of worked with religious organizations as a way of broadening their inclusivity?
When I was with World Wildlife Fund, there was a very strong effort to reach out to some of the religious communities. I wasn't involved with that. One of the things that we're doing under the EE Capacity Project and that we are proposing for year 2 is basically working with the United Council of Churches to work with them to identify how the youth church programs that many of these churches have could incorporate more environmental education. And they are planning to basically do some of that work to figure out how that work would be done. But no, I don't have any specifics right now. But in another year, we probably will have some results from this effort, which will actually look at trying to figure out ways in collaboration with church members on how that might be done. Many religions have a kind of a stewardship ethic about them that's part of the religion, and part of it would be building. It would be essential to kind of build on that. They often have a youth component. So I think there's some natural ties, and we're going to be exploring those in more detail over the coming year.
Great. A similar question. Are you aware of city governments that have environmental education programs that have done a good job with becoming more culturally, inclusive?
Again, I don't have any specific examples. I can go back to NEC, which is a kind of a quasi-governmental organization, and to PEC, which is a kind of a national governmental organization, at least in part. And they were able to make changes with how they did their work. So I mean, those are two examples of how that might be possible. I often think that you look at the people who are in the organizations that to what extent if they reflect the character of the community and are representative of the community, chances are those programs are going to be more in tune with their community. If the people in those organizations are from outside the community, then there's less chance that they're going to actually reflect those values and beliefs and programs that are relevant for that community. And unless you make a special effort to reach out and work with and engage, it would be pretty hard, I think, to move in that direction. I mean, government offices are extremely difficult. Government units are extremely difficult to change because there's such a sort of long tradition and bureaucracy, and it's a tough one. I mean, I think all the things that I said apply, but it's probably 2 to 3 times harder doing it through a government organization versus a not-for-profit or a private organization. So.
Fair enough, absolutely. Gus, I'm going to interrupt you here a little bit. We have a couple more questions, and people are free to ask more. And I think you and I chatted a little bit about if we had more questions, we'd stay on for an extra 10 minutes or whatever, 10, 15 if need be, and I'm more than happy to do that. But I think because many people were expecting this just to be 1 hour, I'm going to bring up the end of session evaluation and ask everybody to indulge in spending a minute to answer some quick questions. And as an incentive, I didn't mention this earlier, but those who do fill out the end of session evaluation, and by the way, Gus, while I'm doing this, you should have a look at the chat room. There's been a great conversation going on here. I'm going to pull up this end of session evaluation. I should do that without further ado. And now you'll see it on the screen, and each of you should be able to control with your cursor, bring down. There's 5 questions in total that will take you about a minute and a half to answer, or less. And those of you who take the time to do so, we'll be picking 2 people after this webinar to receive a 1-year free digital subscription to Green Teacher as an incentive. So please give us your comments, and we'll take a minute or so to do this, to give you that time, and then we'll return to questions with Gus Medina. And Gus, just as you can see when you're looking at the chat box, and as people are filling out the evaluation, let me just say it's been really gratifying to see the conversation that's taken place there this evening, because it's quite apparent, not surprisingly, that those who are signed up on this webinar are people who A, care about the topic, and B, are looking for answers, and many already have a fair bit of experience, as has been shared by the wonderful suggestions you've exchanged with each other. So I'm going to give another sort of 30 seconds with the finishing the survey, and then I've got a couple more questions for Gus, and you will return to that question slide, and you can ask any you have for him. Okay, so in just a moment, another 5 seconds or so, I will click this. So if you haven't even finished, I'd probably suggest you just hit submit right now so that you don't lose what you have filled out on the survey. And if you really needed more time, the email you're going to get from us in the next 48 hours, the follow-up email that has Gus's resources, as he mentioned earlier on, but we'll also have the how one accesses the archive if you want to look at this presentation again, or you want to direct people in your organization or friends. Anybody can freely view the archive in the next 30 days. But there's also an opportunity for those who left this webinar early or didn't have a chance to fill out this end-of-session evaluation to go back and do it again. So if you have a further, feel free to do that when you receive that email from us. Okay, so that's your opportunity to ask any further questions. Gus, I've got two for you here. One is from a state environmental-led organization asking, they know they want to become more inclusive, but they've had a really hard time tracking down the organizations associated with that cultural or immigrant community. Any suggestions of what you would do in a state if you're to find those organizations?
Well, I from the question, I don't know what they've done already, but part of it would be just going into the community and attending some meetings and listening. Another one would be trying to find a cultural ambassador, someone in that community who basically is comfortable both with the association and the community that the association wants to work with, and then kind of I think the first thing is basically trying to just learn about that community a bit more. What's important to them, what's interests them, who are the leaders, how they interact with each other, what are the issues that are important to them, and then looking for some small ways that you can begin to interact. It might be participating in a festival or showing up at a community event or and starting to develop some relationships. Again, it is a longer term process, but I don't think there are any real ways of taking shortcuts on this, because you really are talking about developing relationships. Depending on the community, how it may not be an established leadership. It could be in leaders that are basically within the community and are recognized the community. You have so that's a possibility. Maybe that leadership sort of in an established formal sense doesn't exist, but there may be people in the community who are looked at as leaders by the community. Again, depending on the community and the culture, sometimes elders in the community are important leaders and may be able to access them. So just a few thoughts. Not knowing the community and not knowing what's already been attempted, it could be hard. And also realize that you may have to go to a number of meetings or to a number of visits, and you may have to do this for a while before people start thinking that you're there to stay. That you really are interested, that you really do want to do something. Many communities have very poor experiences in working with folks that want to work with them because they basically come in with, usually they want something for themselves, whether it's information for a study or kind of a support letter for a proposal, and once they get that, they aren't seen again. So, there could be any number of things, and we really need more specifics to kind of be able to provide more concrete advice.
That's a pretty good answer, not knowing the background, Gus. Two questions, one of which I'll answer. You've already answered it too, which is someone asking if you could recommend authors and articles and so on, and I'll say that everyone know that the list that Gus has put together, this resource list that we'll be emailing out as a PDF with the follow-up email, is pretty extensive, and I think you'll find we'll give one lots of background information to pursue. The other question that someone has asked, another question quite different, is how do we take the scare factor out of the environment? And the reason the person's asking this question is, as she rightly is noticing that some cultures have particular fears about the environment, and thus, that becomes even more of an issue to address those fears in some way and to be cognizant of them. Any comments about or any experiences you're familiar with that people have had to kind of come to terms with very different cultural interpretations of the environment?
Yes, there's a wonderful example in the book, What's Fair Has Got to Do with It, where and this was an American who was working in Africa and wanted children in the school she was working at to have sort of a relationship with chimpanzees. And she spent a lot of time working with the kids and kind of preparing them for having this encounter with chimpanzees. And when the time actually came for the kids to meet the chimpanzees, they all they just couldn't do it. It was just too frightening, too scary for them to interact with these chimpanzees. And I guess one thing I think we learned from that particular case is that when you have to respect those fears, they are real, and in some societies, there's some cultures, there's some real valid reasons why you need to be afraid of animals, or parents instill a fear in children because otherwise they would not be safe. So one is respecting that. Then two, I think, is thinking about ways of connecting kids that have those fears in incremental steps, little steps. Nature in their community where they live, exposing them to things in their immediate neighborhood or their backyard or their schoolyard, places that they're already familiar with and are less likely to cause fear. I mean, lots of people in EE and outdoor education often think about taking kids out into the wilderness or to the woods, but if there are fears there, that's the last thing you want to do, especially at the beginning. So you got to try to understand what those fears are. Again, you have to talking to parents, talking to members of the community, understanding what's the basis for those fears. And once you have a better feeling for that, respecting those fears and then looking for ways to help kids sort of approach nature on their own terms and in a safe way.
That's a great answer. And much appreciated. And as you may have had a chance when you had when I was putting up the evaluation slide to have a look or a glance at the chat room, you've seen lots of people have. Whenever a question gets posed to you, I've got 2 or 3 people answering as well with equally good answers. So you're going to have you'll enjoy that when you have a chance to have a look at it. I think this will be a good time for us to to sort of wrap up, we have really addressed almost every question in the chat box. I'll leave you with one final one, Gus, and then when you finish that, I'll ask you to turn the archive off, and I will put the evaluation slide back on afterwards because I know some people didn't get a chance to finish. And by all means, if those of you who are on this call have suggestions of other resources and good contacts, as many of you clearly do, please send an email to myself, tim@greenteacher.com, and I will share that with everybody going out in the outgoing follow-up email. So, Gus, one last question. Working so much in Alaska with Native Americans, this is a challenge really, in not just in Alaska, but in many places, and certainly in many parts of Canada. And they've come, I think, rightly to understand that they really need, in order to be able to work with Native American communities, they have to work with elders. Any suggestions about developing those relationships? I think one of the comments this person made along with their question was one of the things they learned was that they really need to be able to come back to that community at least every year if they're going to be respected and they're going to start developing a real relationship. It's not a one and done kind of thing. Any other suggestions you have about Native American tribal groups?
I mean, based on what I know about Native American, Indigenous, and my interactions, it's all about time. Westerners and Indigenous Native cultures in North America have a very different concept of time. Westerners are rush, this has to get done, this has to basically be done yesterday is usually the scenario. And that's just not, I mean, I can't think of two cultures that are more different. There are probably others, but these are very different cultures with very different values, and it takes time to understand it, and it takes time to figure out the process. I mean, just the whole decision-making process within Indigenous communities they take time. And you can't rush that process. You really basically have to fit your model to that. And I would say, once a year is doesn't seem often enough to me. It would really be better to do it more often. But looking for ways for those to have more frequent interactions. Because I think what you're really talking about is developing trust. And I think if we start from the point of thinking to ourselves, there's no reason why they should trust you. Why should they trust? Why should this community trust you in any form, shape? I think because we tend to be part of the dominant culture, we're used to the idea of being trusted. And unfortunately, I think that gets in the way of actually developing real relationships. I think one has to go in there understanding that one really needs to build the trust, and trust takes time, and it requires sitting down and talking. It requires visiting. I don't know any shortcuts to that. I think the process, as trust develops, it doesn't continue at the same rate. I think you can do things a bit faster once there's a level of trust established. But the bottom line, it's all about relationships and developing those relationships and maintaining those and nurturing those relationships is key to success. I don't know what else to say about that. It's that's what it's about, and that's what it requires.
Oh, that's another great answer, Gus. And it's no surprise that you have been so eloquent and done such a good job answering the questions, and indeed offered us a really rich presentation, full of good practical stories of what organizations have done, lots of practical advice as to how to address the challenges of making organizations much more co-inclusive. And I really can't thank you enough. And not only have you given us a rich presentation and some great answers, I've also never seen a webinar where where there's such a rich conversation and so many good suggestions and kind of a parallel conversation. Many people having already come to some of the same conclusions as you've offered us, Gus. And so thanks to everyone for contributing, and thanks for so many people staying late to the end here. This is really great. Gus, if you can turn the archive off, I will
do that right now.
And I will put the evaluation slide up for everyone else who didn't have a chance to finish it.